I want to talk to you because I listen to every commentary podcast. In fact, I stay in better shape. The longer you guys talk, the longer I trundle or walk. And so I want you to go 90 minutes, not 60. But yesterday, fabulous podcast, the commentary podcast. In it, you made the statement, which made me stop and think. It's the least socially conservative Republican platform since at least the 1960s. Now, Matt, I want to walk down the Trump platform, which he posted on True Social 2 days ago and was reposted. But why don't you generally introduce us to that concept that it's the least socially conservative platform since the 60s? And you're the guy who can make that argument because you're a historian of the intellectual right.
Sure. Well, I went back after I made the comment and I did a little bit more research, Hugh. So the life issue shows up in the Republican platform in 1976. And between 1976 and 2024, abortion and the pro-life position on abortion was very lengthy portion of the Republican Party platform. And the portion called for the Human Life Amendment and a national restriction on abortion, and went into some detail on subsidiary issues involving abortion. Since 2004, traditional marriage has been mentioned in the Republican platform. Again, some length devoted to marriage and the family, the importance of traditional marriage between men and women. That is not in the platform this year. So I kind of would narrow my comment that I made unrehearsed on the commentary podcast and say, from the social conservative viewpoint, the traditional social conservative issues of life and the family, it is the least conservative since 1972.
That is, I think, fair. We're allowed to extend and revise our remarks on the Hugh Hewitt show when you've spoken on commentary in the morning and you come on next day. But let's go through the end of the Trump platform and get your view on whether or not these are socially conservative propositions. I have a bigger point to make, but number one, cut federal funding for any school pushing critical race theory, radical gender ideology, or other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content on our children. Socially conservative, Matt?
Yes, I think so. And I should say, Hugh, and this may be your larger point, what social conservatism means does change over time. So yes. The Republican platforms of 68 and 72, they were socially conservative in their accounts of crime, right, being law and order. Also their accounts of drugs and talking about the drug issue and the war on drugs in 72 that Nixon had begun to launch. What I mean is for about 50 years, the social conservatism meant a certain view of life, marriage, and the family, and that is not present in the Republican platform.
And I agree with that. Since I've been a Republican since 1974 and voting since 1970, I've always been pro-life, but I've always believed in the Constitution first and last, and the Constitution guarantees religious liberty for us to persuade people that unborn life should be protected. But it ought not to, and I believe the court correctly decided it does not, say anything about abortion. It's up to Republicans at the state level to work towards pro-life levels. So as for marriage, I lost. I was the guy who wrote for the Weekly Standard to Mitt Romney, do not enforce this Massachusetts Supreme Court ruling. This is bad. And I thought it was bad. But, once you change the law and people begin to rely on it, and I'm sure you, like me, have many friends who've gotten married who are same sex, you can't change it back. That's actually stare decisis with reliance involved. So that's out of that. But let's go through what remains socially conservative in this platform. Keep men out of women's sports, Donald Trump wrote. I believe that's actually a mainstream position, maybe an 80% position, but it's definitely congruent with the conservative position, isn't it?
It is a hugely popular position. And I think that speaks to what this platform is about, which is it's more of a campaign document than previous party platforms, at least in past 50 years, that window I've been talking about. This platform is the reflection of Donald Trump's agenda heading into the general election campaign. And he's very smartly focusing on that one aspect of the trans controversy and debate, this idea that biological men should not participate in women's sports. That's widely agreed upon, and I think that's why he's emphasizing it in the platform.
Matt, do you agree or disagree? I don't talk about most trans issues, especially as they relate to children, because I believe it's a difficult time for families who are confronting gender dysphoria. And it's an issue that also leads people to turn off the radio. And so as a compassionate conservative like George W. Bush, I just don't talk about it. I do talk about girls playing against boys because that involves not just the athletes, but their families, their coaches, the entire ecosystem of girls' athletics in Title IX. I think that's deeply conservative. Maybe the most conservative issue in America today is to protect women's sports from boys competing in them. It says nothing about people with gender dysphoria. It just says it's wrong. It's absolutely wrong to allow that. Do you want to expand on that?
Well, sure. I mean, you're absolutely right, Hugh. I think in the past, many people have turned to party platforms, not just for one aspect of one issue, but to see what the party is speaking more broadly about a whole host of issues. And so in past Republican platforms, you would have not only had this call to keep biological men out of women's sports, but you would have also had the parties thinking about gender dysphoria, about in particular whether sex reassignment surgeries and therapies should be available to minors. That's not in this platform, except for the fact that there will be no taxpayer funds for these surgeries. So it's a attempt by Trump, I think a smart one, to focus on the most popular parts of his agenda and also the ones that have the widest appeal. It's just very different from the Republican Party platforms that we've been accustomed to, at least prior to 2020, when there was no platform.
A proposition for you to consider. I think it's the most federalist platform we've ever had because the police power involves the surgeries, and that is not appropriately exercised, in my view, as a constitutionalist by the federal government. But we'll come back to that. You know, the Commentary podcast has been the best source for ongoing coverage of the meltdown on college campuses and the pro-Hamas radicals on campuses in the streets. In the Trump platform is deport pro-Hamas radicals and make our college campuses safe and patriotic again. I'm not sure that's socially conservative, but it resonates with me, Matt. Do you think he ought to put that up higher on his list?
Well, I'm glad it's on the list. I think it's important. I also think Israel, of course, is an issue that does connect with those values voters who I've been describing, who've been an essential part of the Republican Party for 40-some years now, and are a big part of the Trump base. So yes, Israel in particular is a values voter issue, and this is the way he comes at it, which is clever because it's also fusing the law and order aspect of Trump, the sense that Trump is the figure of strength who will bring order back not only to the globe, to America's cities, but also to America's campuses.
Now, the last 2 points, and we'll talk next hour. Matt's going to come back from a secure location, undisclosed secure location later. The last 2 parts are secure our elections, including same-day voting, voter identification, paper ballots, and proof of citizenship. Unite our country by bringing it to new and record levels of success. The making America safe for voting again, that is both a throwback to 2020 and discordant rhetoric, but also a look forward to fears about the integrity of an election. Do you consider that socially conservative, or is that just good politics?
I think it's more good politics. I mean, again, I don't speak on behalf of every social conservative in America, so there are plenty of values voters who are concerned about the integrity of our elections. But this, again, is a broader issue. It's a more generally, say, Republican, capital R issue. But it's also smart because it is looking forward, Hugh, instead of looking backward. And I can't emphasize enough, when you look at this platform and when you look at the other moves that former President Trump has been making, especially since the disastrous debate last month, but even before then, it's a widening out of Trump's appeal. It's an attempt to broaden the Trump coalition and bring in groups who have not only been left aside from the Trump coalition since 2016, but who have not really been part of the Republican Party in decades. And here I'm talking about his tremendous appeal among Hispanic voters, his growing appeal among African-American men. Of course, the working class voter who has been so important to Trump, that too is growing. And you can see that reflected in the no tax on tips call in the platform. Again, a platform that is very unlike earlier platforms. And I'm not saying that's worse. I'm saying it's different. And it's different for, I think, a very specific reason, which is former President Trump views the platform not so much as the committee document, a consensus document that will hold him back or that he will be tied to as president, but a forward-looking document that he can use in the campaign and that can also offer the most maneuverability for him in the policy sphere once he's back in office.
I think you guys had it exactly right. I did quarrel a little bit with John when he argued that it destroys the Republican Party. I don't. I think it reflects the nature of the party changing, maybe back to the Lincoln Party, where it's a constitutional republic that respects the states. We've amended that now so that the 14th Amendment makes all of our individual guarantees, including that of freedom for the enslaved, apply to everyone. But when Matt Continetti comes back in hour two, we're going to do from the top down, because actually I think this may have reflected Trump's prudential judgment about the transactions he must make to move the party to the middle. Matt, before we go through points 1 through 15, and we have covered points 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, I want to ask you about something you just mentioned casually on yesterday's commentary pod. There are rumors of North Koreans going into Ukraine. And I put down I tweeted that out. I said, whoa, that's like when Tom Cotton told me it was a lab leak on the air. Where is that rumor coming from, and how seriously do you take it?
Well, I'm not sure how seriously I take it, Hugh. The rumor is coming from the North Korean media, so you can't always believe what the North Koreans are saying. But after Vladimir Putin visited Kim Jong-un last month, there was a report out of North Korea that said that because of the good relationship between Russia and North Korea, a contingent of North Korean soldiers might be headed toward Ukraine, in particular the eastern regions of Ukraine that have already been occupied and annexed by Russia. And our Pentagon has responded to it. I think it's worth taking slightly seriously for two reasons. One is, it shows that this group of powers is acting in concert. Mike Johnson, the Republican Speaker of the House, gave a very good speech at the Hudson Institute earlier this week where he said this is a China-led axis. And parts of the China-led axis are Russia, of course, North Korea, Iran, and Speaker Johnson also mentioned Venezuela and Cuba, and I think he's got the list right. And the second reason I take the news somewhat seriously is, as you recall, back in the Cold War, you often had this where different proxies of the Soviet Union, different communist proxy forces, would often work together and be deployed into various fronts. And of course, the example that came immediately to my mind when I heard about the potential that for North Korean troops to go to Ukraine was Angola in Africa in the 1970s. In the midst of their communist revolution, Cuba sent many troops there. And so it wasn't the Soviet Union intervening directly, it was instead the Cuban proxy. So I think we could see something similar, but it is true that this is just a few stories and we haven't had any concrete proof yet.
Well, that would make explicit, if we see North Koreans in Ukraine, that would make explicit what is implicit, that there is an alliance between the criminal quartet of Iran, which sends drones to Russia, China, which sends money to Russia, and North Koreans, which would send troops, and I thought was going to send ammunition to Russia, and this quartet of criminal regimes. It's not going to get better. It's going to get closer between them, and it's a reason why I think Donald Trump has to win. We have to get serious about national security. Let's go back now, Matt Continetti, to the Trump platform. I'm just going to read a point for you and have you expand on whether it's traditional, non-traditional, or important. Number one, seal the border and stop the migrant invasion.
Right. Well, this is, of course, Trump's signature issue, Hugh. It's a testament to how much he has modified the Republican Party and the conservative agenda, because rather than talking about comprehensive amnesty as Republican platforms were talking about 20 years ago, even in 2012, some idea that there might be some legalization for immigrants already here illegally once the border is secure. We're not talking about that in this platform. We're talking about sealing the border, stopping what's been happening on our southern border, the crisis. And then, of course, point number two, which we'll get to, is the mass deportation program that Donald Trump has been campaigning on quite successfully This is the immigration issue, which has always been Trump's signature issue, has now moved decisively in his favor as a result of the Biden administration's complete failure on the border and the reversal of the Trump policies.
I'm wondering, Matt, how you would connect it back. Mike Pence used to say he was a Christian conservative Republican in that order. And I say, no, I'm a Christian Republican, center-right conservative in that order. I believe in the Constitution. Lincoln did too. He argued it, the Declaration is the apple of gold that the Constitution, frame of silver, protects. Do you think it is constitutionalist in the way that Lincoln was about slavery in 1860? The Constitution obliges the country to have and defend its borders. I think it's a constitutionalist position. What do you think?
Well, for sure. It's certainly within the rule of law to police our borders. And I think in addition to being a constitutional position, Hugh, it's also a commonsensical position. And I think that Donald Trump has always been very shrewd. He doesn't frame his arguments or his policies in ideological language. It's not really left or right that he talks about. What he's talking about is common sense. And I think many people have the common sense that you're not really a country if you don't control your border. And for people who didn't really think that when Trump was president in round one between 2017 and 2021, they certainly think that now because of what they've experienced and because of the extent of the crisis on the southern border and its spillover effects into places that include deep blue states like Massachusetts, Illinois, and New York.
Let's go to point number 3. End inflation, make America affordable again. Now, some people would say that's just classic campaign rhetoric, but it is sort of the number one issue on Americans' mind because they can't escape it. I'm not a young parent. You are. I don't know how you people pay for groceries. You better have 4 jobs.
Yeah, well, I do. So that's how we pay. You have to take a lot of jobs in this Biden economy in order to get ahead and provide for your family. This is the central issue of this campaign, in my view, Hugh. The reason that Biden is losing, it's not just his age and his incapacity. That's a significant reason. The real reason is the 20% increase in the price level since Biden became president. So Trump is very smart to put this right at the top of his list. I think the price level is the reason so many Americans have soured on Joe Biden's presidency. And this in particular, the inflation issue, the price issue, is a classic Republican issue. I mean, Republicans have been arguing for stable prices, pro-growth economy for decades. This is one area where Donald Trump is very much in the tradition of the Republican Party going back a century.
The next point is also in that tradition, I think. Make America the dominant energy producer in the world by far. That also plays into our national security, Matt. Not only does it make it rich, it makes us safe.
Yeah, well, it's a very important issue. Interesting that one of the finalists, as it's been reported for the VP position, Doug Burgum, the governor of North Dakota, has really stressed the energy issue. And I think it appeals to Trump's base. I think it appeals to a lot of people who are concerned about low prices, but also the national security component. It's simply ridiculous that the Biden administration, in the midst of this confrontation with the criminal quartet, as you put it, or the China-led axis, as Speaker Johnson says, would limit our domestic production and our ability to export liquid natural gas, as Biden has. So this is a crucial issue. The environmental issue, the energy issue, is really a creature, I think, of the 1970s and the Arab oil embargo and the beginnings of the environmentalist movement. So yes, in this case too, Donald Trump is in the mainstream, or rather in the tradition of conservatism in the Republican Party.
You know, Matt, I was fortunate to have a long dinner with Governor Burgum, and everyone at that dinner, and there were only 6 of us, were blown away by his grasp of not only oil production, but of carbon capture. And he explained it at length to me in terms that even I am about as far removed from a technical scientist as you can get. Burgum explained it to me, and then he went on to explain nuclear power and how it's absolutely necessary if we're going to be AI and supercomputing dominant because it takes up so much power. Burgum actually understands the future maybe better than anyone in the Republican Party when it comes to energy and what it means. Energy is freedom.
Yes. I mean, in my interactions with him as well, Hugh, I come away with someone, Governor Burgum is completely fluent in policy, but able to talk about what most people consider kind of boring public policy in ways that make it interesting, or at least make it interesting to nerds like me. I mean, one conversation I had with them, he went on about zoning and building roads and infrastructure and all the barriers that the federal government sets up to really developing our communities in ways that make ourselves flourish and make us more prosperous. I thought it was great. So I think if Trump does select Governor Burgum, he'll have someone who is capable of speaking fluently, well-versed, and with great information on every issue.
Matt, the next 2 points on the Trump platform are stop outsourcing, turn the United States into a manufacturing superpower, and large tax cuts for workers, no tax on tips. What do you make of both of those? Yeah, it's silent on whether or not he'll extend the Trump tax cuts, but I assume he will want to.
Yeah, and I think he's given verbal notice in speeches and in interviews that he does want to make the tax cuts continue. I think this is a very interesting aspect of the platform, Hugh. On the trade issue in particular, this is another modification that Trump has made to the Republican Party and to conservatism since his arrival on the national stage in 2015. Really, from the post-World War II era up until Donald Trump, the Republican Party was a free trade party. And I think as a consequence of some of the effects of that, in particular, the introduction of China into the global trading system and China's manipulation of that trading system to its benefit, there have been a real souring on international trade and especially trade with China. So Trump seized that issue in 2016, of course, running against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He won. And in the years since, the almost decade since, he has moved the party, I think, much closer to his view that global trade is a zero-sum game. You don't want to outsource your companies. On the tax cuts,
Matt,
the no tax
I can
on
ask you
tips.
this.
Yep, sure.
It's not an ambush. You know the intellectual history. Lincoln was a Whig before he was a Republican. He was in favor of tariffs. I'm not, generally, except against China. But Lincoln was a Whig and a tariff guy, wasn't he?
He was. So you're absolutely right. In moving the party in this direction, Hugh, Trump is returning the Republican Party to its pre-World War II self. And so in that period, beginning with Lincoln and really up through the Second World War, the Republican Party was the party of the high tariff. So this is kind of a back to the past, a retro view that Trump has reintroduced to the party as a consequence, really, of, I think, China and its outsized effect on American workers and its predatory practices in general.
Some of the tariffs of the first Trump term were really bad, like the tariff on aluminum, really counterproductive. And Lighthizer knows what he's doing. I'm not sure Navarro did. Do you think it will be a more nuanced Trump tariff policy under Trump 2.0 if it happens?
Well, Trump himself has said that he wants a global tariff, the 10% tariff on every product. Now, I think that might be more debatable within the Republican Party. I think there's definitely a consensus, not just within the Republican Party, but a bipartisan consensus about tariffs on China, the need to separate, to decouple, to deconflict, or whatever the blob calls it now, America from China because of our adversarial relationship. On trade with allies, I think there are more people in the Republican Party who still believe in reciprocal trade, free trade with allies than perhaps Trump does and his inner circle does.
Matt, the point number 7, defend our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and our fundamental freedoms, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right to keep and bear arms. To me, a quarter century ago, I wrote for the late, great Weekly Standard a piece on our 6-party system. And the Republicans have 3 parties: the Party of National Security, the Party of Free Enterprise, and the Party of Faith. The Party of Faith loves this point because the Party of Faith has figured out it's all about the judges and Trump delivers. Is that fair?
I do think it's fair. I think it's interesting that this is the point that kind of deals most directly with constitutionalism, which has been, in my view, the bedrock of the conservative movement for the last 100 years. And so in this bullet point, you have a lot packed in. In fact, the mention of the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, that's really the only language in the platform dealing with that. And then you also have the right of religious freedom, which is so important, especially to those values voters that you and I have been talking about, Hugh. So when I look at this platform, in particular, the 20 points that we've been discussing, you have a real brevity, you have a lot of compact language, you have a lot of direct language, imperatives, this is what we're going to do. It's very much a reflection of Donald Trump, who we've been told played a very singular role in editing and even writing parts of this document.
Well, it's all in caps, so it's very much his. Okay, I want to finish on this. A combination of a number of things. Prevent World War III, restore peace in Europe and the Middle East, build a great Iron Dome missile defense shield over our entire country, all made in America, strengthen and modernize our military, making it without question the strongest and most powerful in the world. My friend Captain Hendricks texted me after your first segment, Matt. This is a TR platform. This is a big, bold, strong American military platform. And I love it if he will do it. He promised the same thing 8 years ago. It didn't happen. I mean, the money was spent, but the Navy's still 280 ships. What do you think? Do you think he can deliver this time?
I think the Teddy Roosevelt comparison is extremely apt. I think this time, I think he'll be in a better position to deliver, Hugh, especially because it looks like we may be headed for another Republican trifecta. But also, more importantly, Trump is going to be surrounded by advisors and by lieutenants who buy into the MAGA agenda wholly. That wasn't necessarily the case in the first term. That said, again, looking at this platform, is a lot of TBD. And there's a lot of room to maneuver, a lot of room to make deals, which are so important to President Trump. And so what he's doing is he's laying out the broad goal. He's saying this is what we're going to do, but he's not too detailed on how we're going to get there. And I think that's because Donald Trump, in some ways like Teddy Roosevelt, is a very energetic figure that likes to make deals, wheel and deal, and also likes to allow himself the maximum flexibility so that he can position himself in ways that strengthen the country and also preserve his freedom of action and maneuver.
Last question, Matt. Last time I talked to him in April, I asked him if he would name a list of national security advisors. It could be Pompeo, Rick Grenell, Robert O'Brien, John Ratcliffe. It could be a bunch of people, but just name who he would draw from. Would that serve his interest because this is the area where he was weakest, his National Secretary of Defense, great with Mattis. Mattis left. Bad after that. The Secretaries of the Navy were undistinguished generally. The acting one, Tom, did pretty well, but he got into trouble over the Teddy Roosevelt. Do you think we should know who's going to be on his national security team at the CIA, the DNI, all those places?
I think that would be helpful. It could be the equivalent of his list of judges in 2016, which did a lot to shore up a perceived weakness. I would recommend to everybody, if they haven't read it already, Robert O'Brien's essay in Foreign Affairs laying out what he thinks a second Trump term would mean in foreign policy. I think is essential reading. And I think it's reassuring to a lot of national security conservatives as well, because what the Republican Party seems to be adopting, Hugh, is peace through strength on the one hand, but also that idea of, no better friend, no worse enemy.
The Constitution and a very big military. Just give us a very big military and the Constitution and the judges who will defend it.